Let's bring in John W. Day. He is a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I did want to start by asking you here about that attempted murder charge, because we saw those charges come in. We checked the online records, and he does face several of them. But one of them, of course, attempted first-degree murder. So for that charge to exist and not have something like, let's say, assault with a deadly weapon, but going all the way up to attempted murder, what needs to be proven there?
Right. So prosecutors have to establish to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that this person had premeditation in mind, that they had enough time to plan out what they were doing. They attempted to stab somebody, attempted to murder them. So prosecutors basically just have to establish that the actions of this suspect were significant enough to cause death. Of course, the person who was stabbed is apparently in critical condition, but still alive. Of course, sadly, if that changes, the charge would then be a first-degree murder, not an attempted murder. But again, premeditation in a situation like a first-degree murder charge, which is what's required for first-degree murder, some level of premeditation, that can occur in a split second. That can occur in a couple of seconds. And so what prosecutors are looking at when they make a charge like that, when they file a charge like that, is what are the actions that the suspect engaged in? And in other words, it wasn't a self-defense situation. It wasn't a heat of passion situation. It was something where the person had intent in their mind, and the prosecutors have to establish that.
When you talk about the immigration status, we of course heard from the Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned, they told Fox News Digital that he was in the country illegally. So how does that immigration status kind of play into pretrial decisions when you're talking about bond, bail, things of that nature?
Well, without question, this particular suspect is going to be held without any chance of release, because the history, according to what we've seen, is he's removed from the country, he's deported, he comes back in not just once, but a couple of times. So that just the nature of his status is that there's no chance in the world that a judge is going to let him out. And then you add on the charge here, attempted first-degree murder. There's just no possibility that this person is going to be released pending trial, because the history is one of obviously failing to obey the law. And then you add the nature of this incredibly serious crime, and the chances of this person getting any kind of pretrial release are zero.
When you talk about an attack like this on public transit, does that change anything about the charges, the legal aspect, and kind of how the process plays out?
It doesn't necessarily change anything about the charges, but it's the context of what took place and where it took place that figures into the prosecutor's reasoning. Because, again, this is a situation where apparently, according to police reports, this suspect appeared intoxicated. That really doesn't matter in terms of a charge of a attempted first-degree murder. But it is, it's in a public transit situation, and again, sadly, it's the very same line where the Ukrainian refugee was murdered in Charlotte earlier. And so, a very tragic, unfortunate, and horrifying set of facts, identical almost to the previous stabbing on that line. So the fact that it was on a public transit line doesn't necessarily add or subtract anything from the first-degree or attempted first-degree murder charge, but it is the context of where it took place in a public setting, and again, sadly, on that same line where someone else was murdered.
And that's the video you're looking at here. That was the surveillance video. Very tough to watch, so viewer discretion, of course, is advised. But, that is a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee who's just sitting on the light rail there trying to get, I believe, home from work at the time, and she gets attacked. And now you have this second attack. So that's why I think there's a lot of attention being paid to this. And that kind of leads me into my next question here of how that increased attention from the public. You have people sharing this story all over social media. It's obviously in the headlines on several networks. So how does that factor into all of this as the legal process plays out?
Well, obviously, something like this is going to draw so much attention. And again, because it is in Charlotte, because it's on the same transit line, and because it involves the stabbing situation, in this case, the suspect who clearly was not supposed to be in the country from the start. So the attention is going to be significant on this one. And again, we have to remember that the city of Charlotte had apparently just initiated a surge, a law enforcement surge a couple of days before in an attempt to make people feel safer about being on the transit lines. Well, obviously, it had no effect on this situation. So it just highlights the problems that cities face in terms of trying to keep people safe when they're on these lines. You think the attention in Charlotte would have been so heightened because of the previous stabbing. But at the end of the day, we realized that unless you have a police officer stationed in every single transit car, how do you address that problem? Again, it gets back to the person's status as an illegal, being here illegally, and not just being removed once, but twice, and then he's back. And so this just highlights what's going on and the issues involving public safety and public safety on public transit.
My last question for you here. What do we need to be watching for as this does kind of move through the legal system here in the coming weeks, months, all of that?
Well, again, this is not a situation, as far as we can tell, where the suspect is going to claim self-defense. It's apparently a completely unprovoked attack by someone who had a large bladed knife on them in a public place. Motivation doesn't really matter, and it's not an element that the prosecution has to prove. They just have to prove, at least in this particular case, that there was an attempted first-degree murder. The person intended to stab and kill the person who got unfortunately injured. And so we'll see how the case plays out, but there's really not much of a defense that comes to mind, because it's not a case where there was a fight and somebody pulled a knife to defend themselves. It just seems like a cold-blooded, unprovoked, incredibly tragic situation where an innocent person, at least now, is still in the hospital in critical condition.
John W. Day, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help to discuss the legal process here. Again, we're going to be keeping a close eye, as so many people are, as the case progresses. Anything else we missed? Anything you want to add here before I let you go?
No, again, it just highlights the public safety issue, and you should be feeling safe if you're on your city's public transit. But this just says, you know what, you have to be watchful, you have to be looking out, and we have to be careful about who are the people who are getting on these public transit situations. And, it just highlights the idea that you've got to be not just fearful, but you've got to be watchful and look at your surroundings.
All right, John W. Day, thank you again for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.